It was still dark when the skiffs cut across the water. The pirates were ready, armed with RPGs and rifles, sure their target was another unarmed freighter ripe for plunder. They had no idea they were aiming their weapons at two of the world's most heavily armed and trained warships. What followed wasn't just a firefight, but a masterclass in military precision and pirate miscalculation. Before diving in, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real-world military breakdowns, battlefield insights, and epic moments where bad decisions meet overwhelming force. What happens when pirates mistake two U.S. Navy warships for defenseless cargo ships? You're about to find out. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well for the pirates. The year was 2006. Off the lawless coast of Somalia, piracy was booming. With no functioning navy to protect its waters, the Somali coastline had become a haven for warlords, smugglers, and maritime raiders. Pirates armed with little more than desperation and RPGs had grown increasingly bold. They were hijacking merchant ships, holding humanitarian aid vessels hostage, and even daring to approach cruise liners. But what happened on March 18, 2006, would change how pirates viewed their chances forever. That morning, two U.S. Navy vessels, USS Cape St. George, CG-71, and USS Gonzales, DDG-66, were on patrol as part of Combined Task Force 150, a multinational force dedicated to securing international waters and deterring piracy. These were no ordinary ships. The Cape St. George is a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser. The Gonzales is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Together, they carried cutting-edge radar systems and advanced weaponry, and trained boarding teams capable of striking with speed and precision. At around 5:40 a.m., radar operators on the Gonzales picked up a contact, a suspicious diesel-powered skiff towing two smaller gasoline-powered boats. This configuration matched a classic pirate profile, a mothership towing attack skiffs used to swarm targets. The ships maintained visual surveillance, but unlike most encounters, this time the pirates saw them too and made a fatal mistake. Thinking they had spotted an unprotected commercial vessel, the pirates prepared to board. But what they were actually approaching were two of the most capable warships in the U.S. Navy. As dawn broke, the Cape St. George and Gonzales closed the distance. Boarding teams prepared to inspect the suspect vessel. Standard protocol: approach cautiously, inspect cargo, ask questions, and de-escalate if possible. But this boarding would never happen. As the Navy's inflatable boats neared the pirates, gunfire erupted. The pirates opened fire at extremely close range. Rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons cracked through the early morning air. The Navy boarding teams returned fire and pulled back to safety. Then, the pirates did something utterly reckless. They chased the Navy's boarding teams and turned their weapons directly on the warships themselves. Let that sink in. With RPGs and small arms, they tried to go head-to-head with multi-billion-dollar guided missile ships. The Cape St. George and Gonzales returned fire, not with missiles or massive guns, but with small arms and .50 caliber machine guns appropriate for the close-range threat. They didn't need the big guns. They needed discipline and precision, and they had plenty of both. A .50 caliber tracer round from the Gonzales found its mark, igniting a fuel drum on the larger skiff. Within seconds, the boat was ablaze, eventually burning down to the waterline. The smaller skiffs, realizing the battle was over before it even began, surrendered immediately. The engagement was over in minutes, but the consequences lasted much longer. The wounded pirates were given medical aid not just by U.S. forces, but by a Dutch combat support ship, HNLMS Amsterdam, which rushed a medical team to assist. In accordance with international law, the captured pirates were not immediately prosecuted, but eventually repatriated to Somalia, some after months of medical care. This wasn't just a shootout. It was a demonstration of professionalism, restraint, and lethal readiness. The moment the flames consumed the pirate skiff, the balance of fear in the region began to shift. News of the encounter traveled fast. not just among naval circles, but through the informal networks that connected pirate crews, local warlords, and smuggling outfits up and down the Horn of Africa. What these pirates thought would be a payday had become a textbook case of what happens when you pick a fight with the wrong ship. And yet the real story wasn't just about guns and firepower. It was about deterrence and how the U.S. Navy projects force without starting a war. Let's be clear, the Navy could have obliterated the pirate boats with cruise missiles. One Tomahawk would have erased them from the sea, but instead they chose controlled proportional force because that's what trained professionals do. The message wasn't just, "Don't mess with us." It was, "We can stop you without going nuclear." That's real power. Now let's talk about the strategy. Why were the Cape St. George and USS Gonzales even there in the first place? They were part of Combined Task Force 150, operating in one of the most strategically volatile regions on Earth, the waters around the Horn of Africa, the Gulf of Aden, and the northwestern Indian Ocean. This is where 30% of the world's crude oil transits, where shipping lanes from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa all converge. At the time, piracy off Somalia was reaching its peak. Armed groups, often funded by local warlords or political factions, would use motherships to drag smaller skiffs into deeper waters. These skiffs, loaded with fuel drums, assault rifles, and RPGs, would swarm tankers, freighters, even yachts. The playbook was simple: board, hijack, and ransom. What made this pirate crew different? They were bolder, or maybe just more reckless. Most pirates preferred easy targets, slow-moving, low-riding ships without armed escorts. But these attackers didn't even properly identify their target. Maybe it was arrogance, maybe desperation. But they assumed that what they saw on the radar was another helpless merchant ship. Big mistake. Because the USS Gonzales is not a merchant ship. It's an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, the Navy's all-purpose warhorse. With an Aegis combat system, vertical launch missiles, and anti-submarine torpedoes, this isn't just a ship. It's a floating war zone with over 300 highly trained personnel. The USS Cape St. George? A Ticonderoga-class cruiser, even more capable. If the Gonzales is a scalpel, the Cape St. George is a broadsword, designed to engage multiple targets in multiple domains at once. Together, they made for the worst possible target the pirates could have chosen. But that's the point of naval deterrence. It doesn't just come from brute force, it comes from the ability to apply precise, overwhelming pressure the moment it's needed. And that's exactly what they did. When the Navy's rigid-hulled inflatable boats, RHIBs, approached the pirate vessels and came under fire, they immediately pulled back. But what followed wasn't panic, it was coordination. And it worked. When the pirate skiff caught fire, it wasn't because the Navy tried to destroy it. It was because a tracer round ignited the pirates' own fuel barrels. That's the danger of bringing gasoline to a gunfight. The aftermath tells you everything. The U.S. ships recovered the wounded, offered medical treatment, and coordinated with allies like the Dutch Navy. Not only did they eliminate the threat, but they handled the consequences ethically, legally, and with international cooperation. Compare that to how pirates treated their captives: hostage-taking, torture, and extortion. The contrast couldn't be more stark. And that's why this story wasn't just a one-off incident. It was a watershed moment in how navies dealt with piracy and how piracy began to change in response. What happened after the smoke cleared was almost as significant as the battle itself. The pirates who survived were not tortured, not executed, not disappeared. Instead, they were treated under the Geneva Conventions, patched up by Allied forces, and repatriated. Why? Because that's the code the U.S. Navy operates under. That's how disciplined militaries set the standard, even when dealing with people who broke every rule in the book. But make no mistake, the message was sent loudly and clearly. In Somali ports like Isle and Harardhere, where pirate operations were often staged, the story spread fast. They hit a warship, not one, 2, and got crushed. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a reality check. The U.S. Navy wasn't some distant concept anymore. It was right there, and it wasn't playing. And that was by design. This engagement fit into a broader doctrine of U.S. maritime strategy: presence with purpose, force with restraint, power with clarity. It's not about showing off, it's about shaping behavior. You don't need to destroy everything to win. You need to show that you can, and that you won't hesitate when you must. Let's look at the bigger picture. In the months following this attack, pirate activity dropped in key areas patrolled by U.S. and coalition forces. Other navies, including the Royal Navy, French Navy, and Indian Navy, took cues from how the U.S. handled the situation. They began increasing visibility, improving boarding protocols, and coordinating more directly with one another. Meanwhile, NATO and the UN began more serious discussions about creating legal frameworks to prosecute piracy internationally. Why? Because this incident had proved something vital. Pirates weren't just a nuisance. They were a threat to global trade, humanitarian missions, and maritime safety, and they could be stopped. But it also proved something else, something that doesn't get discussed enough: how quickly things can go wrong. Imagine if that pirate RPG had hit a fuel line on the Gonzales. Imagine if a sailor had been killed. What began as a botched hijacking could have escalated into a multinational crisis. That's how fragile maritime security can be, and how important it is to stay prepared. The 2006 incident is now part of naval history, but its lessons still echo today in the South China Sea, in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Red Sea, where Houthi drones circle shipping lanes. The seas are never fully calm. Ships like the Cape St. George and USS Gonzales are out there every day making sure the world keeps turning. The incident didn't just demonstrate American firepower, it highlighted something often misunderstood by the public: the complexity of rules of engagement, ROE, and how they shape every action a warship takes. When the pirates opened fire on the USS Cape St. George and USS Gonzales, the immediate instinct might have been to retaliate with overwhelming force. But ROE isn't about emotion. It's about mission clarity and minimizing unnecessary escalation. Every sailor aboard those ships understood the weight of their decisions. They didn't just have the power to return fire, they had the training and restraint to apply it proportionally. The result? A perfect example of how tactical precision doesn't require maximum destruction to achieve maximum effect. The Navy didn't just neutralize the threat, they preserved the legitimacy of their presence in international waters, sent a message to allies, and avoided an international incident. What followed was just as significant. Media outlets around the world picked up the story. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and Reuters each presented the incident with different tones, but one common thread ran through all coverage. The pirates had messed with the wrong ship, and they had paid for it. In military strategy, this is what's called informational dominance. You don't just win the fight, you win the narrative. That's why the U.S. Navy allowed cameras aboard afterwards. That's why photos of the flaming skiff made the rounds. The battle had been won at sea, but the psychological campaign continued across headlines and digital screens worldwide. Pirates now had to ask themselves, what if this next target isn't a tanker, but a destroyer with teeth? Tactically, the engagement in Somalia became a case study for naval war colleges, joint training simulations, and international maritime exercises. Several key lessons emerged. First, the value of intelligence fusion. From aerial reconnaissance to surface radar, every layer of surveillance contributed to the early identification of the threat. Second, the importance of interoperability. NATO forces like the Dutch HNLMS Amsterdam provided real-time medical assistance and reinforced the idea that coalition navies could operate fluidly together under stress. And third, the concept of graduated force response, where escalation is tightly controlled, was affirmed as not just ethically sound, but operationally effective. This engagement became a template replicated in later naval doctrines, from anti-piracy efforts in the Gulf of Guinea to the South China Sea deterrence strategies. The impact wasn't limited to military circles. Commercial shipping companies revised their routing protocols. Insurance agencies recalibrated risk models. Even humanitarian convoys operating through the region reported greater willingness to move supplies through previously dangerous zones because the presence of U.S. and allied vessels now came with a proven track record of not just being there, but being capable of doing something when things went wrong. The lesson for every rogue actor, whether pirate or militia, was simple. If you gamble at sea, know who you're betting against. Because sometimes the gray hull you mistake for a merchant ship is actually the last thing you'll ever see. Beyond the tactical victory and local deterrence, the incident off the coast of Somalia had far-reaching geopolitical implications. In the eyes of regional players, the skirmish wasn't just about pirates. It was a message from the United States to the wider world. Nations like Iran, North Korea, and even China were watching closely. If the U.S. were willing to respond with such precision and discipline in an unprovoked micro-engagement, what would it do when the stakes were higher? This calculation wasn't lost on foreign militaries. Satellite intelligence showed that within weeks of the pirate attack, several nations began reassessing the security around their own littoral zones. Naval planners in Tehran, Beijing, and Pyongyang started running new simulations, not just about how to strike an adversary, but about what would happen if they misidentified a target or underestimated its readiness. Even more telling was how non-state actors adjusted their playbooks. Pirate attacks in the region didn't stop, but their tactics changed. They began using more surveillance before launching an assault, avoiding ships with radar arrays or naval escorts, and increasingly demanded ransom from shore rather than attempting to board ships at sea. The encounter had created a new form of behavioral deterrence, not by destroying pirate networks, but by creating uncertainty in their minds. That uncertainty is often the most powerful weapon. Fast forward to today, and you'll find that this engagement is referenced in U.S. Navy planning documents, NATO joint readiness manuals, and even commercial maritime security training. It taught everyone from admirals to deckhands that clarity of mission, layered readiness, and proportional response were not just theoretical ideals. They were proven, real-world doctrines. Perhaps most importantly, the Cape St. George and Gonzales incident showed that asymmetry doesn't always favor the underdog. So the next time a skiff full of pirates or anyone else thinks about testing a gray hull on the horizon, they might want to ask themselves one thing: do we really know what we're pointing that weapon at? Because if it's the wrong ship, the response might just be fast, precise, and final. What started as a routine patrol ended in flames. But this wasn't a victory lap, it was a reminder. A reminder that the U.S. Navy is not just a fleet, it's a philosophy of preparedness, of precision, and on purpose. You don't get second chances when you attack the wrong ship. You get consequences. And that's exactly what those pirates got. What do you think? Should the Navy have responded more aggressively, or did they handle the situation perfectly? Could this type of response work in today's more dangerous waters? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Stay sharp, stay aware. And remember, the ocean has eyes, and some of them are armed.